Okay, due to time constraints, and as you can see the plethora of controllers, I'm going to try to make each description as brief as possible. Alright, well, now first of all we're going to start off with the granddaddy of them all, the Atari 2600 controller. As you could see, it was a very primitive, being one of the first controllers, it was kind of opposite of today, where you would actually control the direction with your right hand while you would hold the controller with your left hand and utilize the fire button. One fire button, 4 directions, very basic. It evolved into the 5200, which adopted a numeric keypad similar to that of the Intellivision, which I will cover at some point. Kind of a lame concept. Moving on to the 7800, which fared a little bit better than the 5200, lost the keypad, but maintained that same joystick design. It wasn't until we come to the wonderful Atari Jaguar, yes, I do own one of these crappy things, where they have a regular D-pad, sort of a start and select button, pause an option, and 3 fire buttons A, B, and C, along with a numeric keypad, which much like the Intellivision had these wonderful inserts. Moving on to the next contender is the Nintendo Entertainment System, the basic controller. It was the first of its kind to have a D-pad, start and select buttons, A and B. It was square, much like the system in design. Not very ergonomically designed, but was one of the first handheld joypads for one of the post-video game crash systems. Moving into the Super Nintendo, as you can see, it became a little bit more ergonomically designed. Still kept the main D-pad buttons, start and select buttons, but as you can see, they added the X and Y button to it, as well as the first time they added shoulder buttons to a controller. So your left hand has a little bit more to do on this one. Then Nintendo did something a little bit more radical when they brought forth the N64. First time they used an analog stick for control. It's a full 360 movement. It kept the D-pad, start button. Not only do you have your traditional A and B buttons, but a set of buttons up here called the C buttons, up, down, left, and right, as well as shoulder buttons, left and right, and a trigger button on the center of the stick, on the center of the handle, called the Z button or Z trigger. 3 methods were used to hold this. The standard, where you would use the D-pad, where you'd have your other hand here. Your normal operating for like Mario 64 or whatever, where you're controlling with this stick while your other hand's here, or your right hand will be here controlling a camera angle or your gun aim while and of course the trigger to fire while moving with the D-pad. It's kind of bulky, kind of awkward. That was one of the main complaints about the controller. Kind of weird to use. But then we went to move on to the GameCube. A little bit more ergonomically designed, however, Nintendo still kept that whole style with the C stick. This generation tended to have two analog sticks as well as the D-pad. Kept your start button, your traditional A and B. X and Y were brought back. Your Z button is still here, as well as shoulder buttons, only now the shoulder buttons are analog, meaning they have a depth to them of how far they can be pressed in. They also have a digital function. If you listen, they click. Once you reach the clicking point, it performs a digital function instead of an analog function, meaning it can tell the difference between pressing it a little bit and hitting the gas. Eventually that led Nintendo to a radical concept with the Wii, starting with the Wiimote. As you can see, It's their first-party wireless controller to come with the system. It's shaped just like a remote. Your D-pad's up here with your A button, plus and minus buttons for the menu, home to get to the home menu, and 1 and 2 action buttons, as well as a B trigger button on the bottom. A lot of the point-and-click games, you will actually use it like this. On some of the older games, and even some newer games like Super Mario Bros. For the Wii, you'll actually hold the controller sideways like this and control it that way. Also, it can be used with what's called the nunchuck, which was an accessory that also came with the Wii. It attaches to the controller port on the bottom of the Wiimote, and what it does is it has the analog stick for movement, used in games such as Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and you have an additional set of buttons, a C button, which is used a lot for camera angles, and Z for your targeting, triggering, or whatever. Used in conjunction with the other hand using the remote, it pretty much functions as a single controller when held together. Also, to kind of alleviate the stress this is given on a lot of traditional gamers, we have the classic controller, which also connects to the remote. Not only can you use the left stick to use on the menus, this can be used with a lot of different games. As you can see, it's very similar to the similar in size and shape to the Super Nintendo, which means they've come back to their original base. But it's very well used on many of the games from the original Nintendo up to GameCube on the Virtual Console. Dual sticks, left and right stick, your basic D-pad, for your Wiimote, your plus and minus buttons in your home, back to an A, B, and X, Y button, as well as your analog digital left and right. And this one has 2 Z buttons, a Z left and a Z right. Oh, well, moving right along to Sega. As you can tell, I do not own the Master System, as I said last week, but this is what I was talking about when I said the Master System's controller was very similar to the original Nintendo. It started off with a D-pad and 2 basic action buttons. As you can see, the number 1 button, which is the action button on the left, also functions as your start button. Eventually, they moved to a more ergonomic design with the Sega Genesis. 3 action buttons on the side, A, B, and C, a start button up at the top, and your basic D-pad. If you look at the connector at the bottom, it's a 9-pin connector. You might be very familiar with this if you do own a Master System, because the controller had the same plug. In fact, Atari uses the same plug as well for its joysticks. So, in theory, you can use the joystick on the Genesis and Master System, and the Genesis controller on the Atari. In fact, I've done so quite frequently. But I gotta make this short. Moving on. I don't have the original Saturn controller, but shortly after its release, Sega took a bold leap with a first-party game called Nights into Dreams, and it released the first analog controller that I can recall. This controller had an analog stick, your basic D-pad, start button, and just like on the regular Saturn controller, 6 action buttons as opposed to 3. Now, Genesis later had a controller for its system that incorporated 6 buttons, but this was the first system that had 6 buttons standard. And of course, this design eventually went on to the Sega Dreamcast. Same design with the analog stick and D-pad, start button, only this time it has a button layout similar to the Super Nintendo, where you have your A, B, and X, Y buttons. And one of the cool things about this controller, if I can do this single-handedly, here's the virtual memory unit. This is basically Dreamcast's version of the memory card. You can play mini games on the darn thing, but when used in conjunction with the controller, you would put it in the controller to save games, but the screen then became a miniature screen for your games. In other words, games like Madden, you could display your plays on the mini screen so that your opponent could not see them. It was made use in quite a few games and was very ahead of its time, just like Dreamcast's ability to connect to the internet. But unfortunately, because of poor marketing, the Dreamcast would eventually fail, and Sega would leave the market altogether. Moving right along. As you can see, these are the 3 PlayStation controllers. The original PlayStation controller, while it did not have the dual sticks until later on in its lifespan, it was a basic ergonomic design that, as you can see, is carried on. Basic D-pad, start select buttons, the familiar X, circle, triangle, and square, as well as 2 left and 2 right shoulder buttons. This design was so good, according to Sony, that they continued to carry it on. The DualShock became the DualShock 2, built-in rumble motor, D-pad, dual analog sticks, start select, same button layout, and this eventually carried on to the DualShock 3, or what they used to call the 6-axis. The only difference between this and the PlayStation 2 one, other than the fact that it too had some motion sensing technology in it, is wireless via Bluetooth. So there wasn't much of a transition there, other than the fact that I remember Sony was working closely with Nintendo on their add-on, which eventually became the PlayStation, which kind of makes me wonder if the controller design being so similar was, mere coincidence. I do not own an Xbox. Everybody knows what I think of Xbox, so if you listen to the Gamer's Playpen, you know my opinion on Xbox and why I don't own one. But here's a basic outline of their controller. The original Xbox had a similar design to the Dreamcast. In fact, I believe the Dreamcast is a predecessor to the Xbox. Similar layout, only this had the dual analog sticks, 4 buttons, 4 action buttons up top, an addition of a white and a black button on there, and your traditional D-pad. I believe there were 2 trigger buttons similar to the Dreamcast as well, if I'm not mistaken, and the memory card slots, just like the Dreamcast, were located inside the controller. The design was eventually changed when coming to the 360. I believe if there were any memory card slots at all, they were on the unit itself, because you would mainly use your hard drive to save games and whatnot. Any kind of memory card slot would be merely used to take your stats and games over to your buddy's house to play. But it evolved in design. They made the controller a little bit smaller, because the original controller was actually huge and bulky. In fact, they made a smaller size because children couldn't use it because it was so big. But the 360 was a little bit smaller. Still kept the same layout. Four action buttons. The 2 in the middle. The X button in the middle was used to link to the system. Your basic D-pad, 2 analog buttons, and of course your 2 shoulder analog trigger buttons. As you can see, controllers have come a long way since the good old Atari 2600 days, but I'm glad to see that we're headed in the right direction. Today's controllers are a lot more comfortable, a lot easier to use, and I'm proud to say that the future is looking bright. Now, with that said, and 14 minutes into our show, I'm going to quickly move on to our Zelda Timeline segment.